shot by Lennox Lewis.
A right hand by Holyfield.
By Buster Douglas. Look at this. He's knocked Mike Tyson down for the first time in his career.
But unfortunately, it'll never happen.
Front punches and punches, and it's over.
I think it's going to be over.
Aguayo in big trouble against the ropes.
I have to say there seems an element of genuine hate between these two, Ambrose.
For sure. I don't hate the man.
Just imagine if you bought a ticket. Stop it, Frank. You can stop it any time.
Castillo's in trouble. Weak steps in, and the fight is over.
Welcome to the Legendary Nights Aftershow with me, your host, Sean, and I'm glad to be joined by our friend from the USA, Luca, who's joined us for another series of an Aftershow. Thanks for coming on, Luca. Thanks for participating in this. I love your insight. I love what you do with your channel. I've always valued you as opinions and value you as a friend, so it's always great when we've got you on the show.
Yeah, I got to bring the professionalism down a little bit. So, that's what I'm here for.
Well, it's a pleasure having you on. I'm really excited to get into this first episode, the opening episode, season 3, George Foreman, Michael Moorer, that we witnessed and we get to relive over and over and over again. And I'm really happy that we told this story and told more of a background on someone like Michael Moorer, who we had never done before, and really putting into context how good he was as a light heavyweight before he moved up to become a heavyweight and completely skips the cruiserweight division. But I'm interested to hear your initial thoughts and feelings and memories of this particular moment in time.
Let's just start with Michael Moorer. Kind of this one fight summarizes him from being a elite guy to the guy that lost to a 40-year-old man. It's kind of funny how this one fight sums up his career to many people.
Yes, it was a bad loss to a man that was considered over the hill, but yet he had been able to hang it with the likes of Tommy Morrison and the likes of the other couple of years prior to this fight happening. So most people thought this was Moorer's night. He was going to take a big scalp in someone like a George Foreman, but it seemed like he carried away in the fight and his game plan goes out of the window a little bit, and Teddy Atlas is telling him, you're going to lose this fight. You need to do this. And he doesn't. You can see in the fight, Foreman sets up that right hand. And then when he lands it and he puts him down, I think everybody at the time was in complete disbelief that this had actually happened. And Jim Lampley's famous, it happened commentary.
I mean, to me, this fight gets remembered so strangely because for me, it was like, I remember reading the newspaper and being excited for Foreman to fight. Being like a young child, you don't think Foreman could lose, right? Because you're like, I'm young. Foreman's this is the great story. Great stories always win in boxing, right? You don't have the life experience. You don't understand. There's talent components. There's age issues. And for me, even revisiting this fight, it's like Michael Moorer is basically winning the whole fight. And then he gets caught. And I think that what's so strange about this fight is it's not a very good fight. It's not enjoyable to watch. It's not some amazing fight. And I think most people expected Michael Moorer to do what Tommy Morrison did to George Foreman not that long after or before. I forget how the trajectory is, but I think it was right after. And I think fights like this are always remembered by the most compelling image. And the image is Foreman knocking down Moorer and the optics of an old man knocking down a guy in his prime. And that's kind of like what always lasts for me. It's just like a single photographic image, not unlike Ali knocking out Sonny Liston.
That loss for him, really, I think it hindered him a lot. And I know I said that he obviously went on and did win a world title again. He did, of course he did. However, I just don't think he was that. He lost that invincibility about himself by George Foreman. And his career, that sort of made me feel, in hindsight, looking back on it, that, it was great for George. It was great. What he did was very memorable and very historic. And, still at the heavyweight division hasn't been surpassed in terms of that record as yet. I know Bernard Hopkins has surpassed that record as being the oldest world champion. However, in the heavyweight division, it hasn't been surpassed as yet. So that record still stands nearly, 30 years down the line. It's like 28 years since that fight happened. And that record, will it ever be surpassed? And I mean, in this current climate, I don't ever think anyone I've seen in this generation, or even some of the up-and-comers that look like potential long-term future stars, I can't see anybody surpassing that particular moment in time. So it begs the question to me, will this moment be a moment that will ever be surpassed?
Well, I think that like records are meant to be broken, so inevitably they'll be broken. But with Michael Moore, when I look at this fight, it's not unlike guys like Chris Colbert or Teofimo Lopez. When they lose, when certain guys lose, even a Canelo losing to Bivol, when you lose and you're supposed to be the immovable force, the unstoppable fighter that's going forward, some guys never come back from that. Some guys have to be that guy that's the train going downhill. And when the train gets derailed, they don't have the repair equipment to fix it. And it's like the show's over. And even though Michael Moore's career continued after this, for a large part of people, this was the guy that lost to old George Foreman. And they're like, oh yeah, I'll watch him fight. But he lost to George Foreman. And I think that that's kind of like what happened here is his whole career got summed up by what is it? 25 seconds in a fight.
And that, I think that as a fan, that's one of the most frustrating things about this tale is that he was one of the great light heavyweights of all time. I'm not saying he's like right up there at number 2, number 3, but arguably he's definitely a top 5 all-time light heavyweight. You know, there is arguments to be made about who is in that top 5, but I suppose if you were doing a top 10, you'd definitely feature Michael Moore as one of the greatest light heavyweights of all time. His record was absolutely sublime. And he skipped that cruiserweight division, as I said earlier, and then moved to heavyweight. And, you know, he captured a world title. He not just captured one, he captured 2. He captured 2 world titles in the process before facing
Holyfield.
George.
He beat Holyfield, right?
He did. Yeah, he did. Exactly. He beat Holyfield in the process, although they say that win was tainted because of Holyfield's heart issues. However, he still did it, and he still did it in a fashion as well.
And Holyfield in that era was the guy. Like, that's the guy that beat the boogeyman. So Michael Moore, going into this fight, had just beaten the guy that went down the street and beat up the schoolyard bully. And then he beat that guy. So it's like, oh my God, here's one of the best light heavyweights ever. And he beat Evander Holyfield. And now he's fighting an aging veteran in George Foreman. We got ourselves another star. It looked like it was going to be Michael Moore versus Riddick Bowe. And we got Lennox Lewis, who never seemingly ever got a fight. And maybe he'd fight a Mike Tyson down the road. And then what it turned into was Foreman just beats him. And then he kind of goes on this weird run of like, I'll fight Jirov towards the beginning of the new millennium. And his career just became really, really strange because it felt like he was always trying to prove to the world that he was more than just that fight.
Well, that is part of the story, really, is that you look back in the mid to late 80s, it's all about doing it on his own accord. And it was like there was always them niggling feelings with George that the way he ended his first part of his career was quite dramatic, really, and literally goes a little bit insane in the changing room, strips off naked, runs around. Obviously, if anybody's not heard our career profile on George, then we suggest that, you know, you do check that out because we do go into more detail about that incident. He takes that last loss in his career. He decides to pack it in. And then as a result of that, you just think George Foreman coming back and the fighters he were fighting at the time maneuvered into the position to fight for the world titles against Michael Moore and was stripped for not defending. I think it was the IBF which stripped him of their title because they wanted him to defend it against a certain individual. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I remember him stripping him of one of the titles, and then he continued on until he ends up losing to Shannon Briggs in 97, and then that's the end of George. But I just feel like if he wouldn't have done this, if this moment would not have happened, in the second half of his career, I don't think people, including myself, would regard George as well as we do now. I think he did get this win on his resume and picked up world titles again because, let's be honest, if he wouldn't have done it, he would have just been seen as a failure, failing in all the attempts in the comeback. So I think it was very significant that this happened. And for him, he obviously is a believer in religion. He believes in God, and he felt like it was a sign that he needed to do this, and he did it. But if he wouldn't have done this in another universe, a big what if, would we have looked at him in the same way we do now as an absolute legend, or would we have just said he was a guy that could have done more?
So the George Foreman multiverse, we got the multiverse where there's another. I mean, you bring up an interesting point because it's like this is probably like the lowest of the low of Foreman's career, even lower than Ali. He had just lost to Tommy Morrison. It's like he's getting back in the ring a year and a half later against Michael Moore to basically be Moore's propelling to these really good fights. Moore looks like the superstar of the division, really, and he's trying to fight the old guy. Now, I believe I either heard this in your story or I've heard this prior, that he fought in the trunks that he fought with Muhammad Ali. And one trainer that I once talked to they said sometimes guys will get knocked out, but on certain nights they won't get knocked out on that night. And it's like a lot of times people talk about Foreman, if he was a front runner and he wouldn't quit. In this fight, it felt like he was going to be the guy that no one ever expected him to be. The guy that would fight through adversity, the guy that would be there all night. And I think that there was something spiritual about George in this fight, that he wanted to prove something to himself. And yes, it changed the trajectory of how we look at him as a fighter. But I also think George therapeutically needed to fight a certain way and win this fight because he personally had never come to peace with the way the Ali fight ended.
It's a great insight to put into it, really, because I just have this this nagging feeling in the aftermath of doing the show that it's the whole multiverse, the whole big what ifs, all that sort of stuff. And you look back on them fights in the lead up to the Mora fight, he was quite slow and quite ponderous. And, if I'm going to make a modern day comparison to who George Foreman of old looks like now, I would say Joe Joyce would be that man at the moment in the heavyweight division who feels a little bit like the older version of George Foreman when he came back. He was just a little bit slow at times, a little bit ponderous, got a pretty decent work rate, still got the fundamentals there, got a decent punch. But George was failing really at the big hurdles until this moment. I feel like Michael Moore threw this fight away because he was winning. He threw the fight away. Was George performing that well? Okay, he says he was setting him up. I can agree with that. Give the fight to George essentially by losing his concentration mid-fight and, gassing as well. He gassed quite a bit as it goes into the latter stages of the fight. So whilst it might seem like I'm diminishing this moment for George, I'm not. I'm just looking at the reality of it and thinking, Moore threw this fight away himself. He was his own worst enemy in it. And he was his own worst enemy in the lead up to it as well. He seemed like he had his head elsewhere at times in the build up to this fight. But I think the whole event surrounding it and then the way he sort of started to fall in the later stages of the fight, I'm adamant that he threw that fight away. He could have won that fight and he could have convincingly won it the same way other fighters did against George in the 90s.
I mean, I think that if we're going to make a comparison to Michael Moore, it would be Tony Harrison for a modern boxer, because it's like Tony Harrison, every fight he's lost, he probably should have won, but it's like he just loses focus in a fight and then he'll just get caught. And it's like the way Michael Moore lost this fight was like, it's like he just could not maintain that supreme focus. I think the strangest thing, and we talked about this in our pre-show meeting, was you look at Foreman, because I remember I had watched Foreman growing up, and a lot of people that listen to this telecast are now younger than me. They might not realize how big of a cultural icon George Foreman was in the 90s. He was all over HBO boxing. He was selling grills. I would almost say George Foreman was as well known as Hulk Hogan, as like an American tough sports figure. And when you go back and look at George, who fought Ali, it's not at all the same person. That's a fearsome, scary dude. I remember I watched When We Were Kings, and I go, dude, this George Foreman's way different than the George I grew up with. The George I grew up with, it's like, that's cool, dad. You disrespect my son, I'm going to come out and beat you up. And I think that it's also like that transformation element was what made people so drawn to George, because I think a lot of people know someone that's had alcohol issues and they have to change, or they know someone. And George's sports career was that of change. Whereas Michael Moore comes into this fight, it's the perfect storm. Light heavyweight, kind of just a boxer, like very acclaimed, but there's not much more than a boxer. And then he kind of gives the fight away, like you said, loses focus. And I think the sad part is we all kind of wanted to see George get this moment. So then it's like, okay, let's give the moment to George. And then the athlete, you know, as just an athlete, there was not really much for us to piggyback on him after that point.
Listen, I enjoyed covering the tale. I enjoyed covering the story because it's a story that will live in boxing folklore for many, many years to come, way from when we're gone. When we're leaving this planet, that story will still be going way after, you know, we're gone. It'll probably still be going after my kids have gone. It'll still be there years to come because it is a moment in boxing, which is why we wanted to cover this episode. Not because it wasn't the definition of a Gatti Ward or a Barrera versus Morales or any of them type of fights, but it was a moment in the sport that happened that lives on. And 28 years down the line, we cover it for our Legendary Nights podcast. We do an after show on it. That's just how much of a moment it was, with all the true insights into what really happened in the lead up to it. I think everything that you've brought to the table about your interpretation of it is fantastic, because it echoes what I feel about this particular moment, this particular fight. And the overall episode for me and Johnston was, we knew we wanted to include this somewhere down the line, but genuinely, we wasn't sure whether or not this would be an entity for people to listen to or to relive that story or relive that moment. You know, the reception we have had from it actually turns out to be contrary, because people have actually really enjoyed reliving the tale and reliving the moment. So it just reaffirmed my belief in this moment, and it will live on way past when we're gone and way past when our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren. I think it's a moment that'll live on forever in boxing. And for me, whilst I love the sport and I love fantastic fights, boxing is all about moments that live on forever. And this was one of them.
And I think that what really speaks to that is this is one of the only fights I remember as a child where like there were interruptions in programming to say, and George Foreman is now the oldest heavyweight champion ever. Like, I don't know what I was watching, but there was an interruption in a telecast to explain that had happened. The only other time I saw that, or I'd heard about it, I didn't see it because I was too young at the time, was when Mike Tyson lost to Buster Douglas. It's like, when Holyfield beat Tyson, these were moments where like the world stopped. And it's like, I think that just to kind of put a wrap on it, most people's version of George Foreman is the old George Foreman from this fight. Like, if you ask people, what does George Foreman look like? They're probably going to describe to you the George Foreman that went out to fight Michael Moore, not the one that fought Ali, not the one that stopped Frazier. This is the Foreman that most people readily identify with.
The whole point of the tale of is to explain to our listeners and people that watch it on YouTube that, you know, you need to understand the context behind this moment. It's not just about that moment. It's about how that moment came about. It's about how they came to this moment. What were they doing in the background? What led up to this pivotal moment of their careers? And I'm glad that we've done this episode. I'm glad that we've done this tale. And I genuinely hope that everybody listening has enjoyed it. And I hope that you've enjoyed our insights into, and our thoughts, of course, and our feelings on this episode as a whole, because we do tend to give a little bit of thoughts, feelings, and opinions in the aftermath of storytelling. But it's these types of episodes like after shows that we love doing, where it's like you could really just dissect in start to think about things in hindsight and start to really think about like the what ifs, the ifs, buts, maybes, the moments in time, what it meant, what was significant about it. And this is why I've loved doing an after show with you, Lukey, and why your interpretation and your perception to the table here. And we kind of get on most of the time in terms of our opinions on this. I suppose before I wrap this up, is there any thoughts you have on the tale of Michael Moorer and George Foreman?
Well, my big takeaway listening to your guys' podcast was this would be a great book because enough time has gone by that people involved in this story, it's like it's really like a story that I think could be unpacked, where it's like if Michael Moorer or someone around him would feel comfortable, if Teddy Atlas could give insights, if Foreman could give insights, people that were around Foreman, because there's a lot of moving pieces, right? Like I'm sure in many ways Foreman resurrected himself, but then Michael Moorer in a way, like what's that called? Like the genie in Aladdin, like for the genie to go back to live in the world, someone has to live in the genie lamp. It's like Michael Moorer became George Foreman from the Ali fight. And then he became that. Like, it's like they transitioned their roles. And I think I was kind of hoping to read a 300 or 400 page book on just the kind of the perspectives of how this one night kind of altered or changed the direction of their life, and even leading up to it, how they felt, because it's a much more compelling fight than the fight itself, but it had such a big impact on the heavyweight scene of the 90s because Foreman was one of the biggest figures. He was one of the broadcasters on HBO, and he was one of the biggest household names at the time. So that's what was my takeaway.
Well, that would be good, wouldn't it, to see Michael Moorer give some further thoughts later down the line. I think Teddy actually has spoken about this on his podcast, The Fight. I think he might have spoken about this already. So I'm going to do a little plug and say, just go and check out his feed, because I do recall listening to an episode where he's speaking about Michael Moorer. It might actually be the Moorer-Holyfield fight that he does an episode on, but there may be a possibility he has done it. I probably should have checked beforehand, but if he has, I think it would be worth listening to from his perspective. But I think I'm more interested in getting the words from Michael Moorer, because I think it's Moorer really who he did say a little bit about the fight in the 2003 HBO Legendary Nights documentary, but he still seemed a little bit bitter about it then, about that moment in time, to know what his thoughts, feelings and opinions were today. Now all these years have passed, about how it really did affect his career and his life after that moment in time. But I've enjoyed doing this after show, our thoughts and feelings and opinions. And I'm sure everybody listening and watching, I'm sure if you've got any thoughts and feelings and opinions, you can do that by letting us know, or you can drop a comment on YouTube, or you can let us know via the Patreon page it's been great. I've really enjoyed having you on. Thank you so much for sitting down to do this after show, the tale of Michael Moorer and George Foreman.
Yeah, it's good to be old. It's good to talk about old fights that meant a lot to me when I was like 8 years old. So it's cool.
Well, so much to everybody listening, as always, to this first after show of season 3, and we'll be back for the after show next week for the second episode of the season.
Right on.